Could I encourage you to take your seats, please? Just a reminder on the screen about the technology. Apparently, a tweet or two has entered the Twitter sphere, but at least one of them didn't include the hashtag from today's event. So if you're minded to do that, don't know if the Twitter sphere will go into meltdown based on today, but please include the hashtag from today's conference so it's associated with the event. Then on the event poll technology, there have been a couple of people taking the texting option, so you can still do that. The other option is using the site, and I did recommend that you use the Wi-Fi for the hotel. The URL is up there. I tried it myself this morning, very straightforward to access. There's a login option there, but you actually don't have to do it. You don't have to put in any details at all. You can just look for a question on the phone and then hit your response. The question for a particular speaker will be available on the phone and not on the screen, obviously, because there'll be a presentation, but it'll be available on the phone throughout the presentation, and then we'll show the question on the screen and people can continue to put in their responses. So that basically gives you 15 minutes or so to get a response in. So we encourage you to participate in that way. Our next speaker is Professor Mardi Dungey to present on the stability section of the interim report. So please welcome Mardi.
Thanks very much. I want to talk about a particular part of the report in terms of the general principles of government intervention table, which is given on table 1.1 of the report under the stability section, and where particularly we're talking about the issues of interconnectivity and systemic risk. Given we only have 10 minutes, so I decided to pick on one thing. In the table, it basically says that we should have a system-wide approach and we should have a view which looks at the interdependence, interconnectivity and feedback relationships between different parts of the financial system and the other sectors of the economy. Now, I think the critical part here that hasn't necessarily been addressed is the financial system and other sectors of the economy. We all know that's what we're really doing. It's kind of not what's in the literature at the moment, and so that's one of the things I want to address. And so elsewhere in the report, the GFC revealed the complexity and interconnectedness was much greater than appreciated. So what I want to do is to show you some work that I've been doing on a CIFR-funded project, which is trying to look at interconnectivity and use that framework to address a couple of issues that come up in the report. So particularly the cost and benefit of using more intensive monitoring and stress testing. The numbers refer to the part of the report where I've drawn these from. The too big to fail issue, can we deal with that by looking at what's going on with monitoring the banks? The role of insurers, which I think only gets a passing mention in the report, and it's not really a huge issue here, though I'll be interested to see what the industry response is this afternoon, but it's a very big global issue. And the permeability of prudential parameters. That is there any case for which the prudential regulator should have some discretionary power for stepping outside their usual mandate in the case of extreme stress, and does that actually bias anything? Okay, so the issue here is that when we think that interconnectivity is a problem, so systemic risk is an interconnectivity problem, the best practice that exists at the moment in the literature is that it considers interconnectivity only in the financial system. Okay, so, and usually only between banks. I'm going to show you, I hope, that this, I think, is a bit of a problem, and it does mask some of the issues that we really care about with systemic risk. So the research I'm talking about, essentially all firms exist in a network of interconnections, and we model those interconnections. It's kind of not rocket science. It's not that hard. It has a few bells and whistles that make it a bit difficult, but it's not like I'm not asking for more data from the industry. I'm just asking for thinking about using the data that's available to extract the information that we have. So it relies on some equity returns data at this moment. I say that, but of course it's actually using circa very complex data sets, but just making use of something that already exists. We also take account of things that we know actually impact on systemic risk of firms from elsewhere in the literature, so firm size, leverage, liquidity, things that we know are important. And essentially the idea is that the more connected a firm is, the higher it will rank in the network and the more we might want to take some sort of account of it. I'm going to, despite Jeff's warning, look at some US data to set some scenes, okay? Because this does tell us something here, okay? We're not trying to look at fees for different products. What you have here is a graph of the systemic risk or the interconnectedness risk of US financial sector firms over the period 2004 to the end of 2011. The vertical line gives you the date of the Lehman Brothers crisis. So what you can see is that essentially it's rising slowly over the period 2005 through to 2008, and you get a dramatic decline afterwards. So it's doing the right thing in terms of it's telling you that there's a risk rising during the period in the build-up to the crisis, but the most important part on this graph is actually the dramatic decline. The dramatic decline here tells you about the intervention's effectiveness, if you like, of TARP and the AIG rescue, because it works in exactly the way an interconnectedness risk thing should do. What it did was it disconnected some of the financial sector risks in the perceptions of how people were thinking about this from the real economy. So one could argue that by restoring to some extent a foundation under the financial sector, we stopped a spiral in terms of confidence and credit creation. That would be the argument for why one might want to intervene with that sort of disconnection view. But we can go a little bit further, and this is where we talk about the insurance versus deposit-taking institutional debate. The top line, the dotted one, is the deposit-taking institutions in the US, their kind of interconnectedness systemic risk index, and you can see the kind of grey line is the insurers. And they paint quite a different picture, and perhaps not what we were expecting. But it does actually make sense when you go and do the balance sheet analysis and understand what's been going on here. With the deposit-taking institutions, what you get with that peak in 2006 is essentially the US housing bubble. So after that, as the banks were stopping their massive overinvestments, if you like, in more and more mortgages, they stopped investing in ABX markets, they started to withdraw a little from the MBS. But the insurers were still stuck with the product. So they had ended up with the credit risk transfer, and because 25% of the assets of the insurers in the US are basically based in real estate markets, they were accumulating more and more risk. So to talk a little bit about a debate that is absolutely huge in the US as to whether insurers should be included under some sort of regulatory framework. What you're looking at here is a plot of on the horizontal axis, the mean ranking of all of these 500 firms that I did from the S&P 500 over this whole set of 8 years of data in terms of their systemic risk. And on the vertical axis, is the standard deviation of that ranking. So the left-hand bottom corner where you see all those little blue crosses, these are firms that are consistently systemically risky. They're consistently highly ranked on the systemic risk rank, and they don't move around much. So you would expect, they're people you'd expect, they're like Wells Fargo, or the big banks in the US. So it doesn't undermine by any means the question, the thing that comes up in the US all the time, that the banks are what are systemically risky. Okay, they're definitely there. But what is clear is that there's a group of red crosses immediately behind them who are insurers. So although the insurers will not be as systemically risky as the banks, there's very strong evidence coming out of their interconnectivity and the way in which they're changing their product mixes, that they are very connected with the rest of the economy and are an identifiable group that we may want to consider around this financial stability. I could say more about that, but let's not. So I'm going to tease you with a few preliminary results for Australia, and I will say that these are very hot off the press. So what you're looking at here is an interconnectivity index for Australia. It's not for the financial sector, this is just for the entire economy. So what this is telling you is that basically the Australian economy, and there are about 300 firms in this sample, is becoming more interconnected over this period. And here we have individual indices for a number of banks. Now I've chosen not to name them at this point, and I've chosen to only give you 3 so that I can torment you with not knowing which one's which. But you can see that we can then get it for every individual institution that's in the sample, and I can tell you something about what's happening to each one. And you can see the sort of thing that Fred Hilmer was just talking about, that we get this, they all kind of maybe look a bit the same. But I can tell you from looking at other institutions in there that not everybody looks the same, and there are different profiles. And in fact, the mining sector and the energy sector are actually extremely interesting. So we're going to do some sectoral analysis. So I hope the implication of all this is that you can go away thinking that, well, if we think that interconnectedness is really important in systemic risk, it's something that we might want to worry about for financial stability, then we probably need to have some sort of measurement of it. We need to be able to monitor it. It's not just something that we want to wave our hands about, okay? It can be measured and it does provide useful information. This is just one approach to doing so. And the data and the methods to do this are already available. We're not asking for more data. We're not asking for, different collections, but it does need the will of all the players to say, okay, we want to do this, and that we need to agree that it's important. I think the results support the need to include insurers. As I said, I don't think that's particularly controversial in Australia. We already have insurance regulation, but it is much more of a global issue. And I hope I've convinced you, even though it was a US-based result, that we can detect some forms of risk and we can detect the impact of policy actions. So those policy actions where the regulators did step outside their mandated boundaries were evident in this in a way that they're not evident in other measures of the systemic risk and the impact of these policies. If you look at some of the other studies, you don't see it. But if the aim was to disconnect slightly, break that cycle between the financial sector's meltdown and the rest of the economy, and hopefully therefore not result in an augmented business cycle response, then one could judge that this was potentially successful. And that does support, to some extent, the need for some prudential permeability. Thank you.
Thanks, Mardi. Some responses have already come in, but feel free now to either text in your response using the number provided or via the application. Quite strong support. Makes me think about the challenge with all the discussion about regulation to meet needs that are identified, the challenge of balancing that with efforts to make sure that the regulation that is in place is as effective as it can be. And one of the features of our system is very costly regulation in some areas, which in my view at least is a key contributor to some of the issues that are attracting a lot of attention in the inquiry and also in the interim report. So that's no doubt occupying the minds of the panel and the Secretariat members as well. So that's quite strong support for that question. Our next presenter is Professor Gail Pearson, who will present on consumer outcomes. Please welcome Gail.
You have some slides. I think I'm not going to use them. Unless you put, you just put them up, Veronica, and you can flip them through. Okay. I believe there is a high degree of consensus around where we want to go for consumers and for the economy, but there's not consensus about how we get there. We all know that. We know that the model which promotes consumer choice for an efficient competitive economy is partly broken. The regulatory model with choice based on disclosure, complemented by financial literacy programs, along with financial planning to encourage selection of products, has failed too many individuals, and too many, although awarded compensation, have not received it. The figures in the report out of FOS are quite shocking, and clearly PI insurance has not been enough. The report suggests policy choices between modified disclosure and product regulation. David Murray alluded to this morning. But there's also a policy debate between a reformed advice planner model and better direct access for all consumers to a wider range of products. Okay, so we know about the limitations of disclosure to individuals faced with making unfamiliar, complex decisions, as most individuals don't read disclosure documents. They're difficult to comprehend. I can't understand them, most of them. And individuals, including the very smart, have cognitive biases in making decisions. Okay. So we know that financial literacy programs do not significantly improve decision making. There's a lot of evidence on this. We know there are significant problems with the quality of advice due to the competence of advisors, conflicted remuneration and conflicts inherited in concentrated ownership structures. We just have to open our newspapers. And we know there is confusion between advice and sales. We know that fee structures, particularly for superannuation products, are a major issue, and we've heard about that this morning. The report should ask if a better regulatory model would be greater direct consumer access to financial products, unmediated by financial planners or platforms, accompanied by financial product regulation, accompanied by mandatory quality standards, and accompanied by suitability requirements. In this model, there would be a clear distinction between sales and advice. There would be information and disclosure. I'm not quite brave enough to say we should completely ditch disclosure. There would be information and disclosure about products and to compare products. There would be avenues for advice on general and particular matters. Those who sell and issue products would have to meet certain obligations about those products, and there would be consequences for failure to meet those obligations. So I want to talk about product regulation and suitability requirements. Regulating product characteristics. The report raises issues of complexity in product development, but there is existing product characteristic regulation already in the system in consumer credit. Think interest rate caps, bans on residential mortgage exit fees, etc. This also occurs to some extent through self-regulation, such as the Financial Services Council standards, but this is not sufficiently transparent. The report should have a discussion of the purpose of product regulation for safety, risk, comparability, etc. This is there to some extent in the discussion of mandated product design for MySuper and whether ASIC should have powers regarding marketing terminology descriptions such as capital guaranteed. There should also be discussion of standardised descriptors such as balanced or advocacy funds and so on. There should be a discussion of the feasibility of regulating fees and costs as a product characteristic, not just as a disclosure issue. The report asks if there are products that should be banned. We should identify products that should not be in the market and ban them. This already occurs in the consumer credit market with short-term credit, but it could be extended to particularly risky products, and ASIC should have the power to ban products. The report asks if some products should be regarded as suitable or unsuitable for different classes of consumers. We should identify products that should not be sold to individuals with certain characteristics. This is already implicit in the distinction between retail clients and others. It also occurs in the consumer credit market through bans, for instance, on small amount credit to Social Security recipients. There should be discussion of relevant distinguishing characteristics of classes of consumers. For instance, retirees, and discussion of powers of ASIC around this. With respect to vanilla products, there should be a discussion of whether a mandated range of relatively risk-free products is suitable for investment products, not just for, say, for deposit products, which we already have. For default products such as MySuper, there should be a discussion of the opt-out and the seduction, to use a term from an American author, of consumers at all stages, but particularly in the immediate pre- and post-retirement phase. Now, more controversially, there should be mandatory consumer guarantees to achieve product quality. Now, before everybody starts thinking, you can't guarantee return, this is not what I'm talking about. There are mandatory consumer guarantees in the Australian consumer law with statutory rights of redress. These have replaced the non-excludable implied contractual terms. This should be considered for financial products, not just the ASIC Act implied term with respect to services, which works for advice, but nobody really seems to take advantage of it. So, correspondence with description and fitness for communicated purpose or desired result at the time of acquisition should not be controversial. Whether a product is described as high risk or low risk is something that should clearly fall within description. What constitutes acceptable quality for a financial product will require modification. The test following the ACL could be what a reasonable consumer, fully acquainted with the product, including hidden defects, would regard as acceptable. Assessing this could take into account the product itself and statements and representations about the product. It could not guarantee future rates of return, but it could assess reasonable accepted rates of return at the time of acquisition. And it may be possible to build some kind of future time frame into this. Turning then to suitability. We should consider an appropriate or suitability requirement for the financial product, not just for financial advice, margin loans and consumer credit products where this already exists. Suitability protects against irrational choice and information deficits. It matches the characteristics of the person with the characteristics of the product. The report discusses pricing insurance products by using big data about people. Can't we use big data to match products and the person for individuals, to benefit individuals? So turning then to better direct consumer access to products. Better product characteristic, product quality and suitability regulation should encourage greater direct access for consumers to financial products. A person can buy insurance from a general insurer without going through a broker. It should not be necessary to access financial products through a financial advisor. The advice model is broken and discredited. I tried recently an experiment. I kept being, but you really have to talk to our financial planner. Yeah, let me give you the card of our financial planner. Okay, planners and platforms with their fee structures add little value for many consumers. Most consumers with, say, a superannuation fund and one or two managed investments do not need a platform. There should be discussion of platforms and consumer outcomes, discussion of platforms around the consumer outcomes issue, not just as a competition issue. Turning then to sales and advice. If nothing else, the term the distribution model indicates that much advice is really sales. The report should consider not just substituting the term sales for general advice as suggested, but it should consider a definitional continuum of information, sales, general advice, if it is truly generic advice, and personal advice. A clear distinction between sellers and advisors would facilitate the enhancement of the quality of advisors by the measures discussed in the report. It should be clear whose products are being sold by sellers, and it should be clear if an advisor is independent or tied to a particular product group. The use of obfuscating words in the industry like capital guaranteed, like distribution, like aligned rather than tied is another issue, but we won't go into that. So greater access to products plus clarity that an activity is a sale rather than advice will require greater scrutiny of the regulation of selling practices. We don't want to substitute selling scandals for advice scandals, but a suitability requirement should limit egregious practices. If financial advisors are necessary in many situations, if access to financial products is by way of sale rather than advice, how much disclosure is necessary? It's arguable that the advice industry has obscured information to know what products are available, compare products and compare like products. There should be better standardisation of descriptive terms and the basis of fees and costs as argued for comparability, and I support many of the disclosure recommendations in the report, and particularly disclosure that's useful for online comparison tools. If we had direct access and online comparison of fees and costs in particular, this should help provide a signal to reduce costs. Who should be protected? The definition of retail client should be revisited. There may not be sufficient protection for individuals who are over the income and assets test but not financially sophisticated. And there also needs to be clarity around whether an individual who borrows for investment is protected under the National Consumer Credit Protection Act. So I support the tenet of the report regarding modified disclosure and better standards for advisors. There needs to be, I strongly support better distinction between sales and advice. I strongly support the move to regulation of the characteristics of financial products. I would take this further and ask the final report to consider consumer guarantees for financial products to complement product regulation, consider suitability requirements for financial products, and think about a market for financial products, not intermediated by planners, not intermediated by platforms, that provides better direct access with product regulation and suitability requirements for the retail clients, and advice that is truly independent advice. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gail. Votes are coming in. Just thinking about this question made me think about what the observations made in the interim report about the nature of duties owed to consumers, fiduciary duty in particular, which I believe the Secretariat and panel are considering further. This is important not just for all participants in the business of giving advice, be they within financial institutions, be they in dealer groups, be they independent financial planners. The nature of the duty, I think, warrants closer consideration. I know Jeff Warren has some views on this. It ties to his observations around governance as well. And I note that David Murray last night, in talking about some of the thinking of the panel at this stage of the inquiry, he's looking at the imbalance between financial institutions and consumers. I'm certainly in no position to speak on behalf of the inquiry, but he basically said that they're thinking seriously about financial institutions and what obligations they should have in this area. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of the final report. A very strong support here in favour of the clear distinction being made. Perhaps that's no surprise given all the debate in the media in recent weeks. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Pamela Hanrahan, and she'll present on regulatory architecture.
Good morning. It's always a pleasure to follow Gail, because some of you know I was the Regional Commissioner for ASIC in Queensland in the aftermath of the GFC, and many of my friends think that radicalised me in terms of my experience of the detrimental effect that unsuitable products can have on consumers. But I'm not quite perhaps so radicalised as Gail, so that's good. We'll see how we go. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to talk about Section 7 of the report, which deals with regulatory architecture. It's a very big topic, so I'm just going to pick three things really to focus on. On the side there, I've pulled apart the financial system into its component parts. So you'll see capital markets, financial services and wealth management, banking and insurance, payment systems, because I think it's really important to remember that the financial system is a set of interlocking sites of interaction, but they don't all have the same characteristics, those interactions, and for that reason they don't all respond in the same way to the same regulatory tools. So in particular, keep your eye on that space that's called financial services wealth management, because I think that's where the really heavy lifting is yet to be done in the Murray work. Now, there's a lot in Section 7 that talks about making regulators better. Like all regulators, I'm a little bit fussy about that. So when I see things like we need better staff or we need more powers, I'm kind of like, oh, okay, well, off you go. So I'm not going to talk about that. The funding question, yes, it probably should be the case that the regulator is not funded out of appropriations on an annual basis, and that's just the experience of having run a regulatory agency that works that way. So I'm not going to talk about those things. Instead, I'm going to focus on three things where I think they're important in a pragmatic sense. They are areas where results are achievable if Murray gives us a clear direction, and they're areas where a clear statement of future directions could have a really significant beneficial impact on financial citizens. And they are in the area of regulatory philosophy and the regulatory perimeter, as it's described in the report, the regulatory burden problem, sorry, again, banging on about that, and I will say something about ASIC's mandate based in part on my own experience, but I hope in a way that's fair. So, as I say, I think this is the bit where the heavy lifting really remains to be done. The Wallace model adopted essentially a pretty binary regulatory conception. So you will often hear about Twin Peaks, but essentially there's kind of a prudential piece, and then there's a conduct and disclosure piece that is supposed to do the work both in relation to financial market integrity, but also in relation to consumer protection. I think that in the financial services wealth management space, there is room for a third way. So if you bear those two models in mind, and I'll propose a third one in the third dot point. But this part of the report really raises two big picture issues. The first is question of perimeter, right? And the perimeter, there's two parts to the perimeter question. The first is, what should be the outside boundary of the net and how permeable should that be? And some of the other speakers will talk about that. I think we need to be careful to remember that the specialist regulation in the financial system doesn't necessarily have to get bigger. In fact, there may be a good case for making it smaller. I've controversially proposed that in non-fiduciary financial services, I think there's an important distinction, that we could actually look to eject a whole lot of back into general consumer protection in the other parts of the economic regulatory system. I'm not convinced, for example, that sales, so as distinct from advice, necessarily need to be regulated any differently from any other kind of advertising practices in the rest of the economy. In consumer products, I will go one step further than Gail and say I think it'd be great in consumable products, so not things that are subsequently traded in markets, but things that people buy because they need them to carry out a financial activity that's involved in their day-to-day life. I'd love to see a disclosure-free one. I'd love to see a financial product that looks like an iPad and doesn't come with an instruction book. It says you already know how to use it. I would back that up with a suitability requirement, but my view of suitability is slightly different from some other people. I don't think it should be for the government to decide what products should be offered or not offered. I just think that if there's a risk that a product is unsuitable, not for the individual who acquires it, but for the market to which it's directed, that risk should sit with the seller and not the buyer. And we can do that. We did it a long time ago, in 1974, with Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act, which everybody said would, bring the world to an end. But we could just have a rule that says if you market a product to a particular group of people and it's not suitable for that group of people and they suffer a loss, then you as the manufacturer of that product, rather than what we have at the moment, which is the purchaser of the product, should carry that risk of loss. So I'm not in favour of governments choosing the types of products we should have, but I think that doesn't mean that we can't have a meaningful discussion about suitability. So the first issue around the regulatory philosophy is how big the boundary should be overall. The second issue is where should the boundary be between the different forms of regulation? So when should we have prudential regulation and when should we rely on conduct and disclosure regulation, or my proposed third model? This is particularly acute in the collective investment space. So if you think about the fact that public office superannuation, which of course consists not only of the individual's money, but also the tax subsidy that you provide to the accumulation of that individual's balance, if it's sitting in a public office superannuation fund, then it's subject to prudential regulation. But if it's sitting in, if a person has a self-managed super fund and buys a non-superannuation product out of that, there's no prudential regulation around that CIS product. And also, once they go into the retirement phase, if they cash out their benefit, then they're in an investment environment where there isn't any prudential regulation. So we need to think about where that boundary should be drawn. And until we've done that work, I think a discussion about whether we need an integrated retirement income regulator might be part of that solution. So that's the first issue. The first issue is about perimeter. The second issue is about this third dot point that I've got there, which is whether, when you look at that binary model in Wallace, does it in fact work for all of the experience that we've had in the financial system since the original report was done? My argument is that the great growth in intermediation, and if you look at, for example, Professor Kay's report on the UK equity markets, and he talks about the number of players in the investment chain and how that's grown, that there are now a whole number of people that stand between the provider of capital and the user of capital. Many of those people are fiduciaries in the sense that they provide personal financial advice, or they are trustees, superannuation trustees, responsible entities and so on. And I think that that's a middle ground where we actually need a third way of conceptualising the regulatory model that we use. And there's a little bit more about that in the submission that will be going in. So some interesting issues there. Just on regulatory burden, There's a discussion of regulatory burden, and I opened it with some trepidation, and then after I'd finished reading it, I felt even worse. So I suggest that you stay away from it. Let me make this point. Discussions of regulatory burden are very unhelpful if they're kind of, well, you know, which bits of the regulatory system for the financial system should we lop off or add to? They're just not very sophisticated. We really need to distinguish between these different types of interactions that occur in the financial system. The interactions that occur in capital markets are different from those that occur in the financial services space with fiduciary intermediaries and non-fiduciary financial advisors, non-fiduciary financial service providers. And then there's a whole space covering prudential regulation, which is not always just about financial resources or liquidity. It does go to things like governance, risk management, and so on. So it's really unhelpful to think about whether there's a regulatory burden overall. It's much more about saying, are we using the right regulatory tools in a complex system to respond to the right problem? That leads me to my slightly more controversial proposition, which is, after long experience, that often the problem in financial regulation is not that there's too much or that there's too little of it, but it's just not very good. And having now practiced in financial services law for quite a while, since somebody pointed out to me the other day, Alan Bond had a fund management business in Elizabeth Street, Melbourne, that had white shag pile carpet on the wall. So having practiced in this area for quite a while, I can say to you that the quality of the regulatory utterances, be they legislative or policy, has really fallen away, and I think we really need to address what the problem is with the way in which we go about formulating regulation. Chapter 7 of the Corporations Act, I will go on record again to say it is the worst piece of legislation ever enacted. It needs to be repealed and we need to start all over again. And if you don't believe me, have a look at how difficult it's been for both governments of both political persuasions to get this FOFA proposition right. It is a flawed piece of legislation. Lawyers hate it, and it needs to be re-examined. But if we're going to do that, we need to really ask the hard questions. And they are, how do we deal with the problem of de-skilling within government that Professor Hilmer was talking about, where there's no capacity in government to do the proper analysis? How do we overcome the problem of drafting by lobbying that we saw in FOFA and other areas that doesn't result in good quality regulation? And how do we give up our very Australian reliance on governments to fix it and move away from a model that emphasises legislative reform as the only solution? Something briefly on ASIC's mandate. Right. Its mission and its brand are both very confused. That's causing it to, its efficacy to be diminished. I think it's time to separate it up, not only because it's different interest groups and different client groups, but the different parts of its mandate rely on different types of regulatory philosophy. Now, the good news is, and I've been saying this to many chairmen of ASIC over many years, is we don't need law reform to do this. The ASIC Act allows for ASIC to be constituted as different divisions, and we could have a Securities and Markets division separate from a Financial Intermediaries division and so on, with different branding, different access and so on. I think we rely on our regulators to do stuff that co-regulators and industry themselves should do, and so I would look at that. And I also think that we should have a look at the prospect of co-locating the parts of the different agencies that deal with retirement income in one place. Again, all reforms that we can achieve without legislative change.
Thanks, Pamela. Questions up? Pretty strong support of the sample so far. Getting stronger. Keep sending the responses in. We are packaging all of these up to provide with all the material from today to the Secretariat. Very strong support for that. Our next speaker is Professor John Piggott. John will present on retirement incomes. Please welcome John.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organisers for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk just briefly about retirement incomes. I'm going to divide my talk into 4 pieces, and I'm going to begin with the demographic challenge. The retirement income chapter falls within a section of the report called Emerging Trends, and I think it's certainly an emerging trend, the need and the requirement for retirement incomes, some kind of retirement income structure. I also want to move on from that to talk about complexities in decision making, which is also addressed in the same chapter of the report. The reason that it's so complex, and I think another speaker alluded to this earlier, is that we have a mandatory pre-funded DC plan, and then we get to retirement and then there's nothing much, and there are very complex decisions to be made in that window. In the immediate pre-retirement phase, when to retire, and then post-retirement, how am I going to arrange my resources through retirement. And then I want to say something very briefly about managing risks in retirement and some regulatory barriers, but the regulatory barriers I'm going to be a bit loose on. This is how the FSI Interim Report set it up, right? So on the left you have more flexibility and freedom, and that's kind of where the status quo sits when it comes to retirement incomes. And then you can mooch to the right and you have incentives and then defaults and finally some form of compulsion or mandate. I think it's important right here to understand what the objective of the superannuation system is. And the objective is actually to CIFR's way of thinking, and I should say that the remarks I make here sort of represent CIFR or many people in CIFR, they're not just mine. When we were thinking about our first submission, we had this first recommendation which said the way to think about this whole issue is to think of the purpose of superannuation to provide a stream of resources in retirement. And everything else falls from that. If you have that as the objective rather than simply accumulation of wealth, then much of the retirement income debate and much of the retirement income chapter just follows. There are 3 pieces to that. There's poverty alleviation, there's consumption smoothing between working life and retirement life, and there's risk management. And particularly around risk management, but also to some extent consumption smoothing, that's really where the action is. It's important to appreciate that the life expectancy of human beings has doubled in the last 200 years, and in particular in the last 60 years, a very odd phenomenon has occurred. In the first 30 of those 60 years, the period after the Second World War up to about into the 1980s, much longevity increase, much life expectancy increase came from mortality lightening in the first part of life, the elimination or the reduction in communicable diseases, infant mortality, reduction in accidents and so forth. In the period since the 80s, much of the life expectancy increase has come from mortality lightening in the latter half of life. And that has a very important implication. It means that the current generation of people approaching retirement are surprised by how long they're going to live. Right? And they haven't actually planned for that. I don't think governments have, and I certainly don't think families have. This gives you some illustration. So if you take Australia there, which is in red, you can see that between 1950 and 1980, life expectancy at 50 for men only went up by 2 years, but in the period since the 80s, it's gone up by 7. It gives you an idea of how important that mortality lightening is. And that's very challenging if you're thinking about consumption smoothing, particularly if you have a preset condition around retirement age. And people haven't fully appreciated this. This is a take on a piece of research that's been done around subjective life expectancy. So people are asked, well, how long do you think you're going to live? And then that's compared against life table cohort estimation. And you can see that people aged 50 actually dramatically underestimate their life expectancy. And as you get older, that gap gets smaller. Right at the end, actually, they overestimate their life expectancy. And this is not just this paper. A lot of these subjective life expectancy analyses find this at the end. I think it's just evidence that optimists live longer. But the number on the top of this chart, right, is a number that comes from just a cohort analysis of life tables. And you can take that apart and do much better than just that. And when you do, life expectancy actually goes up. So Mike Sherris and his colleagues have come up with life expectancy for a 65-year-old male in Australia taking 26 years. So he'd be 91, just to the halfway mark. Right? And so it shows how far people are out of touch with what the reality might be in terms of their longevity. Here's another graph. The left-hand side is just an illustration that if you work longer and contribute longer, and that means you're going to have to finance retirement for a smaller number of years, you're going to do better in terms of how much you'll get per year. But the right-hand side was a survey, and I want to focus on the right-hand side. The right-hand side was a survey of what people thought is the main determinant of retirement age, and then they're also asked by the ABS, well, when do you think you might retire? And the column on the right, financial security was a very important reason. When those people were asked, well, when do you expect to retire, they on average said 62. And I think that is another illustration of how people need perhaps some guidance in thinking about what's going to happen once they retire, given the policy stance that we have taken, which in many ways is a good policy stance around pre-funded DC plans. So what are these risks? Well, this is a kind of standard list, but I want to emphasize sort of that there are two phases to retirement. So the first set of risks there are risks that go all the way through retirement to death. Some of them will be familiar to you. Liquidity risk, by that I mean if you annuitize immediately on retirement and you have no liquidity, and then there is an event which is uninsured for which you need capital, you haven't covered that risk. And I think that chart where it said freedom and flexibility versus risk management misses something critical. The freedom and flexibility part, a lot of that is around self-insurance or family insurance. It's a different kind of insurance. It's not purchased insurance, but it's nevertheless insurance, and that's an important motivation for people to not commit all their funds to a longevity insurance product on retirement. Later in life, there are two other kinds of risks, and I think these speak to what some of the earlier speakers in this session were talking about with regard to product regulation. One is cognitive decline. A lot of people will face dementia in later age. So between 85 and 89, and we've now seen lots of people are going to get to that, right? the statistics on dementia are on 25%, and once you get to 90, 35%. These are high numbers, and they mean that there are all sorts of issues around family strategy and around dependence and so forth, which come into play concerning decision making. Decisions really, self-decisions should really be made sometime before that point. And the second is aged care. A lot of people will enter residential aged care. A third of men, half of women in their 80s, usually in their 80s, on average in their 80s, will enter aged care. Aged care will probably be funded from the family home, so the structure that we have around retirement incomes really doesn't address that. And I think that needs to be taken into account as well when one thinks about the risks. So you really need a kind of two-phase model if you're thinking about how to nudge, direct, incent people to move in their retirement income planning. So managing risks in retirement, as I've just mentioned, I think there are three parties, not two. I think there's government, there is the insurance industry, there are families and individuals. People often say, well, the government bears so much longevity risk it can't bear any more. But I think actually the government is insurer of last resort in this space and in many spaces. The goal should rather be to set up structures which allow the management of that exposure through time, rather than to say, oh, we've got enough, we're not going to do any more. Because you could actually take on a little more and encourage a private insurance market to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And that's something that I think needs to be taken into account. I think late life longevity insurance could work, but there are some barriers. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's some self-insurance. So regulation, my final substantive slide. I was very sympathetic to Patricia's last slide, where she said, well, we need some kind of meta-agency. I think the report talks about some of the barriers to product development, and I know other people have long lists of barriers to product development around longevity insurance. But what strikes me is that the market is going to fail because of information asymmetry. And you don't have to actually subsidize this market, but you do need to support it in a regulatory fashion. And no government agency currently has a mandate to support that market. So if you compare it with private health insurance, you have a health insurance commission and there's a whole structure around health insurance, and we have a very large health insurance buy-in. That's not true in the same way with longevity insurance. And it's because whether you're APRA or ATO or Treasury or DSS, right, to name just a few of the agencies where you would need approvals to market a product, none of those agencies has it in their mandate to support a longevity insurance market. And so there's no positive structure to try to develop that market. And I think that's an important observation to make. So I have to go back to this one. Where does CIFR end up sitting on this continuum? Well, around defaults, and maybe somewhere between defaults and mandate when it comes to some kind of late life deferred instrument because of that cognitive decline problem. So I think they're the major things. I think there needs to be alignment. So to treat this incentives and then defaults as two separate things, I don't think that works. The incentives have to align with the defaults, and so does framing, so does the way in which you present information about this through the life cycle. So income at retirement should be part of a member statement. I think all that has to fit together, education and so forth. If it all fits together, I think you could change the lump sum culture and it could become a retirement income culture. So I will stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John, for that presentation. I think John did a fine job of outlining and educating us about the array of risks that we face, not just the traditional risks that people think about. There are other risks, cognitive impairment and the like. Now, this question, you could debate this area for a long time, and I guess it's philosophic in a sense, but it just a general question, just considering the risks that John talked about in the main, in the round, at a high level, where do you see primary responsibility lying in the industry? So we're interested in your views on that. I think the mix of responses indicates the difficulties that we all face in this area. Okay.